Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on which part of the world you are in. Welcome to our webinar today, which is entitled Expert Briefing, Asking the Right Questions. This is an introductory session about Expert Briefing, a new product collaboration between Emerald Publishing and also Oxford Analytica, where we intend to showcase how unbiased expert analysis of recent current events in topics like COVID-19, climate change, poverty, policy response, and global recession, which can be used to bring thematic teaching to life. Firstly, let me introduce myself and the Emerald team present here with me today. I'm Wan Yat Singh, the Regional Manager of East Asia from Emerald Publishing, responsible for most of the markets in Southeast Asia, with Japan and Korea included in the list. I'm located here in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Together with me today, we also have a few of our regional colleagues joining the session. They are our regional managers and directors from Australia, Taiwan, and India, respectively. All our regional representatives have vast experiences in the publishing industry, with Gino Arispe, our regional director at Emerald Publishing Australasia, who has worked in the publishing industry for over 15 years. With past role at KB, Ovid, Lippincott, and Thomson Learning, just to name a few, he is a true bibliophile who firmly believes that students, scholars, libraries, as a community of practice, can use knowledge to drive impact and change the real world. Stan, on the other hand, is our regional manager in NET, based in Taipei, and he has worked with Emerald for over 8 years and within the industry for more than 15 years as well. He is responsible for the markets in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Thailand, and Vietnam. Last and certainly but not least, Sundar, who have joined Emerald in 2015 and is currently heading the South Asia operation for Emerald as Vice President of South Asia. With over 2 decades of experience in publishing industry, having worked with global publishers like McGraw-Hill, Cambridge, and Springer Nature, he's an avid follower of the higher education and research space in South Asia, who strongly believe that right blend of content and technology are going to be the key drivers of ever-evolving higher education research sector. Besides the regional representative, we also have our marketing team, Lindsay, Rosita, Catherine, Disha, and Ali, to help out on managing technical aspects of today's session, and also to actually monitor the questions we get out throughout the whole sessions today. Every day, we read about things happening around us. Obviously, COVID-19 being one of the most talked about topics in recent weeks or months, to other geopolitical areas like the impact of US-China technology and trade war. How will all this disruption impact us? What impact would it have on the SDGs? Hopefully, in today's session, we will be able to tackle some of these big questions, as we have got Nick Redmond, the Editor-in-Chief and Director of Analysis from Oxford Analytica, helping us to ask those right questions in his sessions later. Nick leads Oxan team of analysts and oversees the global network of 1,500 experts, delivering actionable insight and trusted judgments that allow governments and companies to succeed in complex global environment. Prior to joining Oxford Analytica in 2019, right, he was the director of editorial at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, an independent, non-partisan think tank focused on questions of international security and geopolitical risk. Beside Nick, we also have Natalie Jacobs, the head of products at Emerald Publishing, who will be explaining in more depth about our expert briefing, which is powered by Oxford Analytica and the platform itself. Natalie has over 15 years of experience in publishing, working in editorial, sales, and product roles with experiences in both McGraw and also Cambridge assessment. In Emerald, Natalie is responsible for delivering a compelling product and service experience for customers. She focuses highly on real commitment to understanding the delighting customer, innovating customer experience, deep familiarity with agile product development, coupled with vision and solid commercial management. Thank you, both Nick and Natalie. Appreciate your involvement and effort in this. And I'm really looking forward to your respective session later. Just some housekeeping note for everyone to take before I pass the floor over to Natalie. If anyone have got any questions, comments, or anything which you would like to highlight to any of our speakers or regional representatives, do type them in the chat section. The marketing team will be monitoring the questions throughout, and we will try to get through as many of them as we can, depending on the time availability. Just in case if there are some questions not answered due to time limitation, don't worry, we'll definitely be contacting you after the session to address them accordingly. With that, and not to delay the sessions any longer, I will pass the session over to Natalie for the introduction of our expert briefing. Over to you, Natalie.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. As said, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the partnership that we have in place between Emerald and Oxford Analytica and give you a little bit of an overview of the product that we have launched together out into the market. So as we move into a new decade with new challenges, Emerald has teamed up with Oxford Analytica to deliver a unique digital resource called Expert Briefings, delivered through our Emerald Insight platform. Expert Briefings meticulously explore the implications and impact of global emerging trends and developments. It offers university access to the same daily information that leaders are already using to make real-world decisions. Expert Briefings are already widely used by world leaders working in governments and in industry to establish risk, inform their strategy, and also to make sound decisions. The collaboration that we have in place supports Emerald's strategic priority around the diversification. It provides new content types for our existing academic customers. It also reinforces our commitment to focus on commissioning interdisciplinary, mission-led research that inspires positive change in our world. It further expands our global network of subject experts across a vast range of academic areas and disciplines. And it strengthens our ties to a global community of practitioners and policymakers, allowing us to facilitate the process of turning research into policy and policy into practice. Expert Briefings offer unbiased analysis on political, social, and economic events. It's delivered in the form of daily briefs that provide instant updates, and these briefs explore the implications and impact of the emerging trends and developments. The briefings are created by from analysis by a team of over 1,500 contributors, and every briefing is objectively reviewed by Oxford Analytica's team of experts. Because of this, they are trusted to be informed, accurate, and rigorous. And this is why they're used by world leaders working in governments and industry. In addition to the daily briefs, there's also an archive of over 20,000 expert briefings from the period of 2015 to 2019. The resource itself allows researchers to identify the most urgent problems of today, and it encourages research that can be directly applied in the real world, especially in the areas of business, politics, economics, international relations, and policy. Data is collated from many verified and sound sources by Oxford Analytica's analysts, and so there's no need for other individuals to trawl the news and other websites that may have political or regional bias. As we think about the students, Expert Briefings has real-time content that they can relate to. It can help them see how global and local events are shaping their future, and it can also help you to engage and inspire them with timely insights into topical events that are unfolding around them. You can rely on this trusted evidence-based source to help your students apply their learning in the real world of work. And it also offers the thought leaders and influencers of tomorrow a historical frame of reference for the key decisions they will make by exploring the context of past decisions that have impacted political, social, and economic events. The concise and structured nature of the briefings allows students to quickly identify the information they need to support or counter their arguments. As we flip to look at it from a faculty perspective, in a climate of rapid change, teaching on core theories can remain very relevant by applying analysis of these recent events quickly and easily. It can support tailoring course content to current students and the current world circumstances using both global and local examples. Oxford Analytica experts have already done the work of distilling the data down from a multiple of sources and to identify what is important and understand the broader significance. Daily briefings provide a single source of current content that can be easily used as pre-read for seminar discussions and debates or to form a basis of lectures. In order to show you how easy this resource is to use in teaching, we've taken the core subject of sustainable development and considered various multidisciplinary themes, for example, gender and climate change. We can now consider them through the eyes of current events, creating quick but reliable content for courses in politics, economics, international studies, and management disciplines. Our expert briefings cover a huge number of topics, and this slide really is just a snapshot of some of the coverage of our recent expert briefings. As you can see from topics such as the COVID-19 pandemic and cybersecurity, the content is extremely relevant to what's happening in the world right now. Local issues are analysed by a global community of experts who come together to provide analysis, implications and predictions that best capture the reality of events without any bias and with complete transparency. Internet searches can obviously provide real-time updates on these types of topics, but the quality of the results can very much vary, and you cannot always trust the source that you're reading from. And unlike a newspaper, the analysis that we have in our expert briefings is by regional experts and not just a report of events as they happen. So let's have a little look at some of the briefings that we've had from the region over the last couple of months. If we take a deeper dive, we have examples from across all our regions. A recent briefing from August looked at the COVID-19 burden in India as it reached 3.2 million cases and 60,000 deaths. And the briefing really provided an analysis of the pandemic management variations by state and how that was impacting on the country. As we look towards Asia, we can see from a recent briefing from July looked towards South Korea's economy and compared the GDP growth during the COVID-19 pandemic to that of the 1998 financial crisis, and looked at the government stimulus and the potential impact that would have on the country. As we look to Australasia, a briefing in July looked at the likelihood of New Zealand opening the border at the time when the country was in a strong position with regard to COVID-19, as well as looking ahead at the electoral and political implications. That one in particular, I think, would be interesting reading now that we know the outcome of the election, and we can read that with a little bit of future knowledge in mind. And last but by no means least, we also have a briefing this month about the impact on the reduction of travel and tourism has had on Thailand's GDP and what the impact of that might be for the country in the coming months. Oxford Analytica have a carefully structured process to identify the topics, and then they use their unparalleled global expert network to write the various briefings. Once the briefs are submitted, they're reviewed and then edited and published. And the editorial process that they go through generally produces three main content types. The first of these is an executive summary. And one of the unique features of expert briefings is that the detailed analysis is condensed down into formats that can be read very quickly and easily. It eliminates multiple hours of time needed for research, and the content can be trusted to be unbiased and reflective of the situation. As you can see in this example, it's very quick and easy to read. The language is clear and the format is condensed, providing insight into a topic for students at every level. Some of the briefings take a more long form format. This is often the case depending on the information and the topic. And it's very much crafted to ensure that the information can be consumed easily in a structure that includes an assessment of the significance, an analysis, and also a conclusion. So basically, what's happened, why does it matter, and what do we think is likely to happen next? And then lastly, we have our graphic analysis, which is another incredibly valuable feature type. There's a huge amount of information, for example, on how COVID-19 could disrupt trends globally, But in this graphic analysis, it's been presented in a format that's engaging and very easy to understand. There are a variety of additional pieces of information and sources that are provided in the links, and it gives a very clear snapshot of the situation. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this has provided you with an overview of expert briefings and the benefits we feel that they can offer. But obviously, please do feel free to pop questions in the chat if there's anything you'd like to know more on.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for the detailed information about expert briefings and its relevance to the academic community. Now, getting to know about a product is just one aspect, but demonstrating how it creates real impact by analyzing world events to provide an accurate and balanced summary of worldwide implications is another. For that reason, today we have with us Nick Redman, Editor-in-Chief and the Director of Analysis, Oxford Analytica, answering 3 important questions that will explore the impact and implications of COVID-19 in relations to climate change, poverty, gender equality, policy responses, and digital access. Without any further delay, Nick Redman, everyone.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon or evening, wherever you are precisely. On the first question, starting straight in there on the impact of COVID on climate change. I think it's worth noting at the outset, and actually it affects all my answers here today, is that we need to distinguish between the effects of the virus itself and the effects of government responses. And I say a point that start with a point here that might be fairly obvious, but is actually important analytically to get a grip on, because although the virus is the same the world over, government responses have not been. Plans have been different. The implementation of plans and the effectiveness of plans have differed. As we see over time now, with the pandemic taking rather different courses within regions and between regions, and the effect differing, partly as a question of government capability. So the impact on various aspects of life is not uniform. It does vary a great deal. I think it's important to remember that. We said it at the start of the pandemic 6 months ago, 8 months ago, we're saying it still today. So specifically on environment, the situation before COVID-19 as regards the global challenge of combating climate change was quite a difficult one. The prospects for meeting the Paris targets was uncertain. Much of the climate diplomacy was focused on the decision of the Trump administration to quit the pact, which everyone else among serious emitters, bar Turkey and Iran, was a party to. Yet the reality was more complex. Many Paris signatories were acting in ways that were actually likely to boost emissions, not reduce them. So the Climate Action Tracker, which is one of the indicators that we look at, showed that only Bhutan, Ethiopia, India, and the Philippines had made commitments and efforts to help keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, and that only Morocco was on track to meet the target of keeping warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, that being the lower target that was strongly recommended within the pact. Policy programs in Russia and Saudi, Turkey, and the United States received the lowest possible scores. Now, on the company front, as the question here is partly about companies as well as governments, many firms in rich developing countries were beginning to come around. The sustained push on environmental, societal, and governmental goals was beginning to gain traction among the major shareholding entities that boards are beholden to. I think Microsoft's pledge in January 2020 to be net carbon negative by 2030, to have removed all historical emissions by 2050, and to invest $11 billion over 4 years to fund technologies that will break the link between economic growth and power consumption was a sign of change. And given that company's influence on its supply chain and its customer chain, I think there was potential for that to ripple through. Now, in the wake of COVID-19, even big oil has come around. BP's plans to go greener involve shrinking its oil and gas output, embracing solar and offshore wind power, looking seriously at battery technology, and converting filling stations from gasoline to electricity. So what has COVID-19 done to the climate battle? Year-on-year carbon emissions are likely to decline notably in 2020 as a result of prolonged disruptions to economic activity and many people staying much more at home. The longer these persist, the deeper this short-term impact is going to be. But whether it's a blip or the start of a longer-term decline, is going to depend largely on the economic policies that governments assemble in response to the disruptions, which comes back to my initial point about the virus being the same, but the policy response being different country by country. These are difficult imperatives for governments to reconcile. They need to restart economies, not least to save their national budgets, and to support employment. Can the determination to build back be translated into a plan to build back better or build back greener? The problem is that not all technological solutions, in terms of the transition of economies from carbon intensive to less carbon intensive, or not at all, a lot of the problem is that these technological solutions either are not yet proven and affordable, there are some proven, but they're still very costly, and there are legitimate concerns that the greening of the economy could be net negative for employment, particularly among some sections of society. In short, the fear is that the green transition will be costly and job destructive in aggregate. To give just one example, the shift from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle is likely to cut the number of engineering jobs, as there are fewer parts in an electric engine than there are in an internal combustion one. So in March and April, as many countries locked down and the scale of the economic damage became apparent, in many countries, at least in Europe, there was in many countries, opinion polls showed that the priority attached to the environment fell as the spectre of COVID-19 deaths and unemployment loomed. Yet the response in some parts of the world, Europe I'm thinking of particularly here, is there's a determination on the part of governments not to waste this crisis. The EU's recovery plan seeks to build back greener through a digital transformation, a green transport transformation, and an infrastructure modernization project, with recycling to the fore. The national plans of France and Germany likewise envisage an economic transition that's probably been facilitated or accelerated by the crisis. Yet still the costs of this transition and the impact on employment are difficult to forecast. Emmanuel Macron has given himself a hefty insurance policy by extending job support up to the next presidential election. But very few other leaders around the world can afford this luxury. And even in some richer countries beyond Europe, there's a question as to whether plans for tighter emission standards will be delayed or watered down to help the economy get back on its feet. And this calculus extends to developing economies too, including the largest. So in China, provincial governments are rolling back the strict China 6B emission standards for vehicles in favor of lighter 6A measures. And some that didn't get as far as implementing 6B, and so we're currently on 6A, are actually rolling back to China 5 standards. At the same time, the central government is still pushing ahead with its desire to promote electric vehicles within the economy, so the picture isn't all gloomy. But the scale of the challenge facing the planet with regard to climate change is so severe that we need every indicator to be moving in the right direction. Let me conclude with some observations about the power sector and industry. Big emissions reductions in recent years have been achieved within developed markets. Sorry, still on our previous slide, just in case anyone's put off by that. Big emission reductions in recent years have been achieved by scaling back coal-fired power stations, switching to gas and generating more wind power. In the UK, the country I'm sitting in currently now, for instance, emissions have been cut by 29% in the space of 10 years. But this has been the relatively easy part. For European states, the next stage is going to involve a massive expansion in renewables activity, making big breakthroughs on carbon capture and storage, electrifying transport, and cracking the challenge of hydrogen. For a range of countries, the required big cut in emissions must come from switching to hydrogen from gas, but producing it economically and with low or no emissions is a big ask. In the developing world, breaking the reliance on coal will be hugely difficult. India, the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases, has a target to cut its carbon intensity by 1/3 by 2030, compared with that 2005 starting level. Yet the power sector is still reliant on coal. And for India and other Gulf states, coal is the cheapest, quickest way to increase electricity output in a fast-growing economy. The latest signs here, in fact, are not good. In May, the Modi government rescinded an earlier regulation requiring power plants to use washed coal, which has lower ash content than unwashed coal, and therefore produces less particulate matter when it's burned. China's CO2 emissions fell by 25% during the lockdown, but now they're higher than ever. Half of the country's generating capacity for electricity is based on coal, and China plans to add new coal plants that will increase that generating capacity on coal by a further 12.5% in the next few years. This is largely the result of decisions by provincial governments that want cheap power and want to support local mines. Nationally, the 14th five-year plan, which is currently being written, will include a cap on carbon emissions for the first time. However, the proposal as currently drafted is now being watered down to give China more scope to burn coal. And the greater concern that we have is that the prospect of commercial hostilities with the United States, a subject that I know has been raised in questions, maybe we'll come on to a bit later, is going to strengthen the hand within China of those who advocate relying on coal because it's domestically abundant and therefore it is a more secure source of supply in the face of difficulties abroad. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So what are the prospects for poverty reduction and gender equality in a post-COVID-19 world? We've done plenty of work on this, which is within the Expert Briefing series. And as you'll see from the outset of the crisis, we published quite extensively on the potentially very serious impacts on progress made in the last few years and short-term prospects as a result of the economic dislocation caused by many of those government decisions on lockdown in response to the massive health threat of the virus. On poverty, half of the 193 countries that adopted the Sustainable Development Goals a few years ago are not on track to achieve the goal of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030. In 2019, at least 8.2% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty, which is defined as living on less than $1.90 per day. The optimistic estimates projected this would increase perhaps to 6% by 2030. Sorry, it would decrease to 6% by 2030. The pandemic has drastically revised these projections. In April, the World Bank estimated that 49 million more people would suffer extreme poverty globally by the end of this year. And of these, 23 million are projected to be in sub-Saharan Africa and 16 million in South Asia. This will mark the first time when global poverty will increase in 30 years. The impact is likely to be felt most strongly by those who live close to the poverty line, as they face unemployment, loss of remittances, and disruptions to basic services. It's one of the great unequal measures of the pandemic, as many of us sitting at home, if able to work from home, can attest, because many parts of the world obviously cannot do that. Now, most governments have responded to the pandemic with measures such as cash transfers and fiscal stimuli, but these measures are unlikely to be sufficient or to reach vulnerable sections such as refugees, migrant workers, and the displaced. Partly due to the pandemic's impact on poverty, the World Food Programme has warned that some 265 million people will suffer from acute hunger by the end of 2020. Now, moving on to gender, let me start with some numbers. A 2017 McKinsey report noted that women's equal participation in the labour force could add up to $28 trillion to global GDP. The International Labour Organization placed average male labour force participation at 74% and that of women at 47%. A 2020 study found that women's rights in marriage, inheritance and custody, and domestic violence levels are the best overall predictors of state stability, and even more than control of variables such as urbanization, ethnic fractionalism, and former colonial status. So the importance of gender in fixing other things matters very much. A 2014 academic study showed that women's greater participation in public life, particularly higher rates of literacy or parliamentary representation, is correlated with a lower likelihood of a relapse into conflict. And gender equality makes aid projects more efficient. A 2018 academic study of 107 developing countries covering the period 1986 to 2010 found that when countries had higher levels of women's economic and political empowerment, foreign aid dedicated to child health was more successful in reducing infant mortality. So several donor countries and a few others are adopting feminist policies to try and promote this gender equality effort. And as you might expect, Scandinavia is at the forefront of this. So there's a Swedish policy rooted in the 3 R's of women's rights, representation, and resources that sees gender equality as a prerequisite for reaching the country's foreign policy goals. Canada has made gender a core action area for international assistance. France has pledged that 50% of the development funds it disburses by 2022 will go to projects with the dedicated aim of reducing gender inequality. Mexico itself has adopted 5 principles, ranging from parity and representation across all levels of its foreign ministry roles to combat gender-based violence. I have a few Asia examples which I'll touch on in a moment. A wider trend which we saw is that in June 2020, a study by the Council on Foreign Relations, an American think tank, indicates that gender-focused international policies are now proliferating. Institutional gender equality practices in the OECD countries date from the early 2000s. Most, such as Ireland's 2004 Development Cooperation Policy and Japan's 2005 Initiative on Gender Development, offer guidelines for gender mainstreaming, but without clear goals or monitoring metrics. And this is where the focus is now turning. So several countries have adopted or substantially strengthened their benchmarks and announced specific aid targets for their gender programs. Australia's 2016 Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Strategy declared that at least 80% of aid must effectively address gender issues regarding its primary objective. Now, the first ambassador level post focusing on gender equality was established in 2009 by the Obama administration in the United States. Since then, 10 other countries have created comparable roles. Some 84 countries have adopted national action plans on women, peace and security since 2005 to advance women's participation on security issues. 11 new countries adopted such plans in 2017 alone. And in 2019, several countries, including Bangladesh, joined their ranks. On the trade front, according to a 2018 WTO paper, 74 agreements included over the previous 30 years, I should say, included some gender-related provisions within them. The first with a dedicated chapter on gender equality was the 2016 Chile-Uruguay Free Trade Agreement, a model adopted by Canada, Argentina, Israel, and the EU in multiple other trade negotiations since. Multilateral institutions have followed suit, setting norms that can shape the behavior of signatory states. In 2014, APEC created a Women and Economy dashboard to track efforts to advance women's economic empowerment in member countries right across Asia. The 2019 dashboard showed clear progress since 2014 in some areas, but women's access to the internet and declining maternal mortality, but slow change on political representation, equal pay, and access to capital. New pooled funds such as the World Bank's Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative launched in 2017 and the US-led 2X Challenge for G7 countries announced in 2018 have mobilized billions of dollars in state investment in female-owned businesses. And it's notable that all of the incoming rotating members of the UN Security Council this year emphasized their commitment to gender equality in the campaigns. So the issue diplomatically certainly gaining a lot of traction. But what about accountability? By designing policy as a feminist, governments have opened themselves up to greater scrutiny. Accordingly, governments of Sweden and Canada have incorporated new reporting requirements and other accountability measures to track the progress of their feminist policies. And accountability is sorely needed. Many countries continue to fall far short of their promises. For example, on aid targets, funding for projects whose principal goal is to advance gender equality remains low across OECD donors, reaching only $132 million in 2018. Now, COVID-19 risks slowing the implementation of these new policies. This is the case in countries such as Mexico, which announced its new plan just months before global lockdowns. Post-pandemic budget constraints are set generally to shrink development aid. Some of these principal aid powers will focus a fundamental shake-up of their spending priorities and urgent needs. The focus is going to be inevitably on recapitalizing health systems, and as I noted earlier, to guide an industrial transition and support employment. This is going to create a pressure on aid budgets. Yet, as with the green agenda, there is the potential to harness the new momentum, or in other words, to not waste the crisis, in the service of gender equality. And given the pandemic's disproportionate impact on women and the established economic and political benefits of improving gender equality, we might see some countries trying to consciously align their foreign policy and aid goals by focusing on women's empowerment. So it may be that in a situation where aid shrinks or at least remains the same over a number of years rather than growing, at least within that, there is more targeting on some of these specific goals and objectives, which, as the broader research has shown, has huge positive spillover effects in terms of development, stability, conflict reduction, and peace promotion. Let me move on to the next slide. The final question: what will be the impact of the US-China tech war and global recession on digital access? I think I'd like to focus mainly here on the question of provision of digital services by government. Governments in the post-COVID world will face citizen expectations for significantly better public services going forward. Such expectations will be difficult to meet because of the financial constraints imposed by debt accumulated to fight the pandemic and to address its economic consequences, as I mentioned before. Many governments will seek to leverage artificial intelligence and cloud computing-based solutions to meet new needs. Now, in recent years, governments around the world have been increasing the use of AI, the cloud, and other ICT-based solutions to improve the quality of public service delivery. This year, social distancing measures put in place to contain the spread of COVID-19 and the need to respond swiftly and effectively to new social and economic challenges have already prompted public sector service agencies to increase the pace of this transition. These efforts have largely focused on access to software and on use of cloud computing, where the data are stored remotely in data centers, from where ICT-related services such as tax collection processing and the different services that depend on digital identification are provided. The attraction of the cloud is often that it allows organizations to cut costs by sharing infrastructures and services. It can also help improve the efficiency of public services and facilitate citizen access to them. Most AI services are also delivered from the cloud due to the processing power and data storage they demand. They can be used to increase the advantages inherent to cloud-based services, thanks to technologies from natural language processing and computer vision to deep learning and predictive analysis. Expectations of what AI can currently achieve are often exaggerated, though with some applications of AI in service provision do point to significant advances for the public sector. Governments can use data trails generated by citizen and business interaction with state agencies to feed AI in at least 3 beneficial ways. Firstly, a platform made available by the Australian state of Queensland offers citizens a personalised services dashboard based on their age, location, and past experiences with regional government. Personalisation is possible. Secondly, machine learning algorithms, which identify patterns in large data sets and use them to predict future trends, can improve planning in several ways. A case in point is the Firebrand system, which computes fire risk scores for thousands of commercial properties in Atlanta, United States, to help reduce the city's fire rescue department to make decisions about inspections without relying exclusively on randomization or intuition. And thirdly, AI technologies help governments simulate complex systems in areas as diverse as military operations and national private sectors. So, for instance, the UN Development Programme and the Alan Turing Institute have developed a tool that simulates policy outcomes. It's already being used by various tiers of government in Mexico, Colombia, and Uruguay to support decisions about which policies to prioritize as they seek to meet the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Many of the problems that the private sector face when applying AI also affect governments, and often with higher stakes. For example, police forces across the world have embraced facial recognition technologies to identify crime suspects. Yet such technologies frequently rely on databases built from information collected when marginalized social groups are subject to excessive policing, which results in them being overrepresented in the data. Hence, the technology may increase discriminatory action against these groups. This bias can be aggravated by low levels of accuracy in measuring some AI applications. When the London Metropolitan Police used automated facial recognition to search for wanted people during the 2017 Notting Hill Carnival, more than 98% of those identified were actually innocent revelers. Low accuracy in turn could at least initially go unnoticed and hence unaddressed when governments struggle to attract a critical mass of skilled workers in this area, especially given the high salaries on offer in the private sector. Now, transparency may also be negatively affected, notably because of the black box problem in deep learning systems. The internal autonomous workings of neural networks that transform input data into specific output are inherently inscrutable. Regardless of the fairness of the resulting decisions, opacity is bound to undermine trust in the public sector. Beyond such challenges, governments also face structural hurdles that might even make their efforts counterproductive overall. These constraints will be particularly acute for resource-constrained developing countries, although developed countries are not immune either. Contracts between government agencies and vendors are normally denominated either in dollars or in a dollar value converted to local currency and are updated regularly and often annually. I'm talking here about financial risk. This means that the future depreciation of national currencies will put a strain on meagre budgets. Interrupted payments would disrupt key public services that by then would rely on vendor-related providers, from online tax collection to access to health data. The infrastructure required to maintain centralized services, such as high processing power and vast data storage capacity, can only be offered by a handful of companies. So the point here is we need to worry about the power of a very few. The additional cost of constant investment in research and development to maintain this infrastructure further reduces opportunities for firms from most developing economies. Data centralization and ICT infrastructure concentration will in turn make leading companies ever more profitable and efficient. So this generates a cycle in which technological dependency of developing countries can increase, hurting their own prospects for innovation, which is relying mostly on data access, or rather to an increasing extent on data access, and undermining the local digital economy. Now, poor cloud infrastructure and unskilled workforce are going to be therefore serious problems. Having data processing hardware and extensive broadband infrastructure is critical to developing a healthy digital economy capable of meeting the voluminous demand generated by digital government. Many countries lack these foundational elements and the skilled workforce necessary to make it work. While governments can promote large infrastructure investments, in part by creating an attractive environment for broadband and cloud computing firms, the problem of insufficient hardware and skilled workers can only be solved in the longer term. And consequently, in the near term, states that were already better prepared technologically before COVID-19 are best placed to meet the new demands generated by the pandemic. Growing adoption of information and communication technology solutions for public service delivery are going to widen the gap between the more and the less capable states. Better prepared governments will become more efficient and responsive as a result, while others are going to struggle with poor infrastructure and the lack of a qualified workforce. High expenditure in the cloud and dependence on a small number of these really big vendors could have negative consequences for governments, and it could undermine the digital economy's growth in developing countries. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Natalie and Nick, for your insights on expert briefings. I request my colleague Rosita G to share what questions we have received in our chat for our panel today.
Thanks, Disha, and hello, everyone. To our panelists, Nick, Juan, and Natalie, we have received some interesting questions. since we started this webinar. It's a mixture of questions from different angles, from products, source of information of these expert briefings, the coverage and such. So for the first questions, which will be for Nick, how do you guarantee the quality and relevance of expert briefings, and who are the contributors?
The contributors, as Natalie noted at the start, come from a network of 1,500 experts that we have globally. This is a network that we're constantly curating. We do it because we have academic advisors and our own in-house experts that are active in their fields and go beyond simply academics too. So they know who the best people are to write on a topic. Those are the people that we reach out to. Those are the ones that we recruit. When material comes into us, it's not simply published, it's reviewed, it's critiqued. We have a process that lends something from academic disciplines in order to filter out very obvious cases of bias, to challenge particular views, to road test the material. We've developed that technology, those techniques, those methodologies over many years, constantly refining them. So we have a process where we do commission carefully, we review carefully, and we push the material out. And if you want to know whether it's regarded as reliable or not, then you only need to look at the client role we have of leading governments, leading international organizations, and companies that rely on us every day to give them unvarnished analysis.
So that means, can academicians or students also publish or write to expert briefings?
Sorry, I beg your pardon, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so that means continuation on that. Can academicians, the rest, or students publish or write to expert briefings? Do you allow that?
Do you mean, do we allow submissions from?
Yes.
So we do. There is a page on our website where people can offer their expertise to Oxford Analytica. Sometimes we will add a contributor via that method, but we tend more to go out and recruit for ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Next questions on the format of the briefings. So it's for you, Natalie. What is the difference between the three formats of the briefings? When they discuss about one issue, will it be available in three formats or one issue per format?
Generally, I think the question posed is a single format, but you may have overlap between the various features. So a single issue might have one lens with a long form feature format. A portion of that might be presented as a graphical analysis where there's particular data or something very visual that needs to be presented. And there may be snapshot pieces that come in the short form. So with our three formats, there's the long form, which is the more extended, more structured piece of writing, a short form that is can have similar information and is textual based like the long form, but is more concise, and then the graphical analysis, which is visual. So we don't necessarily see that each briefing is delivered in each of the three forms, but there can be overlap depending on the content.
May I add a little something here?
Please do, Nick, please do.
on the longer form, if you look at those top paragraphs with the event, the significance, what next, that's a way of giving an executive summary of the piece. So if you're short for time, the long form looks a little forbidding to you. You should be able to get a really good sense of what the core argument is just based on reading those few paragraphs. If you haven't done that, then some of my team haven't done their job. So let me know and I'll have a word.
Feedback, yeah. Okay, Nick, to contain COVID-19, governments around the world are enforcing different levels of control towards civilian lives. Will the pandemic push us towards a more total surveillance society in the coming age?
So I've missed that one word, to a more, what kind of society?
More total surveillance society.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really difficult to make any calls like that, and because as you said, as the question acknowledges, the policy responses differed considerably, country by country, region by region. We had a question at the start of the pandemic, which is this going to be good for authoritarianism or is it going to be good for democracy? And I think if you were to put results into a league table, you would see that actually there's no clear answer to that question. A league table would really mix up at the current level governments by their type. So I think it's very difficult to tell. I think some of the interesting aspects around AI, as I was talking about, and technology, suggest that actually the tools are there for authoritarianism as a form of government to actually have some first mover advantage and some on certain aspects of it. But I think it's very difficult to draw the question generally. If I can put it as a final point, in many countries, we are now into uncharted territory in terms of the relationship between the government and the governed. It's never been tried before. And also already see in a range of countries, discipline around observing lockdowns is beginning to fray. Very difficult to predict how things are going to be 2 years down the line if we're still living with COVID at that time. So it's a great question. It's one that we're constantly looking at, and we're looking for the reeds in the wind that will tell us which way things are blowing. But I can't give you a definitive answer to that right now. But I think in any case, it's really going to vary regionally. We're not going to be able to generalize to any useful extent, I suspect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, these are more a little bit general. Does COVID-19 widen the gaps between the developing and developed economies, or does the virus actually help to reduce the gap?
I think the evidence we have thus far is that probably it's going to increase disparities rather than narrow them for a few reasons. One, that governments in developed world actually have the option to furlough workers for a time and so preserve people. Those more advanced economies, particularly with more advanced telecoms infrastructure, and everyone on the call is part of the ins as a result of this, can work from home. If you're a manual laborer, if you're in an informal economy where the government doesn't necessarily know about you and then can't therefore target any kind of support at you, that becomes much more difficult. So when you add in that, you add in then the prospect that there might be some shake-up of supply chains, which shortens them a little bit. I suspect that probably this is bad news for developing countries rather than others. Even if global growth is suppressed by this, the starting positions matter a great deal.
Right. Thanks, Nick. And this is on subscription model. So it's for one. What is the difference between the purchase and subscription collections?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jay. The purchase model, right, is actually a kind of single payment model, and that gives the perpetual access to all of most of our EB content, which is between the year 2015 to 2019. So there's only roughly about 24,000 pieces of Expert Briefing content in that collection, and you get perpetual access for this collection. Whereas for the subscription model, right, is actually a rented access, but it's for the most current content, which is the inclusive of the 2020 and 2021 content, plus the backdated content of 2015 to 2019. The main difference of this is you do not get perpetuity for the subscription model.
Right. Okay. We've got questions on free trials later on. At the moment, okay, for Nick, how will COVID-19 affect the global value chain as adopted by most companies prior to the pandemic? What will the impacts on countries?
It's a really big question, a really pressing one right now. I think it's worth bearing in mind that, of course, the difficulties that many states had in sourcing basic medical equipment, to say nothing of breathing machines and other higher-end medical apparatus, obviously put supply chains into focus among publics, as has never been the case before. But it's not a case that these systems were just static before that and are now facing the shock. A lot of supply chains, which are within companies and just happen to be across countries, are actually complex, evolving systems that were already under numerous pressures, whether it be from technology, from increasing environmental reporting standards on entities, or whether from changes in market demand. So in some more developed markets, time to market became more important than cost at market, and that changed the logics of supply chains that maybe were lengthy but took a lot of time. So generally, supply chains were thickening and shortening already before this crisis. But obviously, COVID-19 has put things into a whole new perspective. Supply chain indeed wasn't even something that many company boards were looking at. It was a middle management decision. It was one where the standing order was simply deliver us a small cost cut every year and we're going to be happy. Well, now boards are looking at supply chains as never before, and governments in certain areas that they designate strategic, and the definition of strategic is increasing, are looking at that too. What's going to be the impact? Well, I think for some industries, definitely we are going to look at shorter supply chains, potentially reshoring, most likely greater regionalization of supply chains, maybe building in some redundancy, maybe also making things more networked. And the interesting question is around data. Data is potentially the great leveler and the silver bullet, particularly in companies that are time stressed. Look for just a moment at Amazon's great success as a logistic entity out of the fact that it has data mastery. The companies that are more successful are going to be the ones that have a much better real-time sense of where their supply chain is at and where the potential problems are going to be. So I think it will be varied across industry. Some will be disrupted more than others. And while some businesses would really like to address supply chain issues, they're themselves fighting for their lives right now. If we look at the economic effects of the pandemic, we can put it very simply like this. Initially, there was a supply shock as factories shut down, and in various parts of the world. And you only need one shutdown in one part of the supply chain, ultimately, to affect the end of it. But the bigger, more lasting problem as factories have come back is demand. Some demand in some sectors is lower, considerably lower. Is it going to grow back, or is this actually a long-term shift? That's a question facing many companies. So companies fighting for their lives right now might think supply chain is something we need to address, but whether they have the wherewithal to address it, and if the supply chain isn't their immediate problem, whether they will address it is an open question. You asked a little bit about winners and losers, and it's really difficult to say. I think generally within Asia, because Asia now is such a big market itself, you could see supply chains within Asia shortening. So it may be that Asia has less of a role in meeting demand, say in the United States or Europe, but the domestic market is growing sufficiently that it's not necessarily going to be a net loss. That raises an interesting question in Africa for Europe, or in Latin America for North America, whether there are supply chain opportunities to be picked up there. But at the moment, with the pandemic, with travel restrictions on, it's actually quite difficult to do outsourcing to those places, because although a lot of it can be done by phone lines, ultimately one does actually need to visit places in order to set up these things off pat. So difficult question to give a broad answer to, but I hope there's some contours there that I've provided.
Right. Thanks, Nick. A few more questions, and this one is on product for Natalie. On citation, how do your researchers cite any expert briefings articles they have used? Can these briefings be cited in their research?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have Oxford Analytica as the author for all of our expert briefings, and then obviously the year that the briefing was published for that part of the start of the citation. Each of our briefings has got a title, so that is obviously what we put into the citation, and then the overarching publication is listed as expert briefings. If anyone is in any doubt, though, when they are on our Emerald Insight platform and they are looking at any of the briefings themselves, we do also put the citation down in full so they can copy that into any of their research when they wish to use this.
Right. Thanks, Natalie. Nick, touching a little bit on the forthcoming US presidential election, For Asian countries, okay, what is the significance of the forthcoming US presidential election for Asian countries in general?
It's really interesting as a question because for the rest of the world looking at this election, they're interested in US being at a crossroads, say, in terms of trade policy, because the Trump administration has taken a particular view of what the United States trade balances with some countries is and should be, and where problems are. But for US voters, this is an election that's going to be much more about healthcare, about the state of the economy, and about a range of domestic issues. So actually, when you do polling on this, what is consequential within this election, really, the answer really varies according to where you are sitting. Within Asia, obviously, the big question is around Trump or Biden. Do we have a continuation of this America First policy, and particularly singling out of China as a technology champion and one that must be held back and constrained in the 5G field, as opposed to Biden, who I think is going to, well, as said, he will adopt a slightly more conventional United States policy. I think it's important to note that Biden is not going to be a restoration. The rest of the world has moved on somewhat in the past 4 years, so we can't simply have a pivot back to Obama. What we do get, though, with Biden is a sense that there will still be tariffs on China and sanctions on China, but they're going to be around the more traditional foreign policy issues. It won't be an effort simply to try and reset the trade balance by imposing tariffs in order to lessen imports and then encourage China to improve its import of American goods. So there is a basic policy distinction right there. We'll obviously see which way the US electorate goes on that. So I think trade's the big one. There's also going to be questions, I think, around whether the US defense budget is going to be in the next few years, because evidently it's already been it's grown hugely. It's already been tailing off. What is American appetite? And I think that's the problem. There's this idea that we can have another 4 years of Donald Trump, or we can go back to some probably for many people slightly more comfortable set of arrangements where United States policy was more predictable. But actually, that's not the case. It's very clear that the domestic priorities are going to be pressing on Biden if Biden were to win this election, as they will be on Trump. So there's going to be less US attention there. There's going to be a deficit, and I'll leave it on this, between demand in some Asian countries for US engagement and the supply of that engagement from Washington.
Right. Thanks, Nick. Can we take a trial to expert briefings? Can we subscribe as individual, or will it be institutional?
Yeah. As for trial, right, definitely. I think on the screen there is a contact where participants can actually email to get a free trial. And normally, in normal circumstances, we will just allow a 30 days trial period after the applications. But I mean, during the unprecedented time like this in COVID-19, right, we actually extended another 30 days for the trial immediately right now.
So it'll be institutional, yeah?
Yes, yeah, definitely institutional.
Right. Back at you, Nick. You talked about the green agenda in your presentation just now. Many said that human economic activities have been slowed down because of COVID-19 lockdown, and might have a positive impact towards the environment. So what is your opinion?
Well, in the short term, definitely it will. But the problem is that simply keeping more people at home is not sustainable, particularly in the developing world, if they do not have the prospects, as we are doing right now, of working from home. So it will be interesting to see if some more polluting activities are curbed, or the overall level of demand in aggregate is. So short term, yes, this is positive, but the bigger questions, as I mentioned in my presentation, are around, for governments, for businesses, do they seek simply to go back to normal as soon as possible because they have debts to pay and have ongoing expenditures to try and address, or is the space within that harness this crisis and this moment of disruption that makes people stop and think maybe we can do things differently across a whole range of activities, whether that can be harnessed in order to redouble the effort to put the world on the path to lower emissions. Because for sure, the challenge ahead of this crisis, going into this crisis, was the world was struggling to get on the right track to meet those 2 degrees or 1.5 degree emission caps. I suspect COVID is not the great needle mover in this regard, because bigger forces are in play, but it is an opportunity. So don't focus so much on where emissions are going today or tomorrow. Don't celebrate too much the fact that emissions are going to be lower in 2020 than they were in 2019. It's more a question of where we're going to be in 2025 and 2030.
Yep. Perhaps another 2 more questions for you, Nick. On the digital services by government issue you have touched just now, what is driving United States to shut out Huawei from its 5G network, and what will be the impact on this? Are there similarities with recent developments in Australia and the Great Britain?
It's a really good question. If you talk to the United States government, they will tell you this is mostly a question of security. And that was certainly the position that the Australian government took, because the Australian government in many ways was actually the first mover on this. If you look at the position of other countries, and you see that those arguments are rather different. I think in the United States, ultimately, one can design this through the various policy initiatives. Ultimately, it was a feeling that China was about to steal a march. It was almost a Sputnik moment. So 1957, the United States for years ahead of this moment thought that it was well ahead of the Soviet Union in rocket technology, and then the Soviet Union actually put a rocket into space, later put a dog on a rocket into space, and it profoundly shocked the United States out of the sense of technological superiority. And what often happens in these cases when a government like this has been shocked is it grossly overreacts. So it doesn't see, in fact, that the Soviet Union, in the case of the United States back then, was not way ahead. It had a particular technological advantage that it had done quite well. But the United States, I think a year or so ago, arrived at its Sputnik moment in terms of China and 5G, a realization that China, by focusing on sort of physical manufacturing rather than software, as so many of the Silicon Valley companies had done, actually was threatening to get ahead. And moreover, 5G was going to be a gateway for China to dominate in related areas, whether it be Internet of Things or cloud computing or AI. And so the great concern for the United States at that point became, we need to slow the Chinese down, because this is ultimately about mastery in the 21st century. And there was within this the huge sense, which is actually widely from the United States, that China's technological advantages were part based on the lifting on a grand scale of American IP over the previous 20 and 30 years. So there's the strategic driver, which has security aspects to it behind that decision. The interesting case, I think, and I don't say this because I happen to live in the UK, is the UK decision. Because whereas Australia was quite firm at the start on keeping Huawei out, the UK decision, taken by experts rather than by government ministers ratified the decision, was that it was possible to set up the network in such ways that the security concerns around Huawei's involvement in 5G could be contained. But when the United States blocked Huawei's access to American microchips, at that point the decision changed. Without these basic American technological feed into Huawei's network then was considered unreliable. And so that's when the UK decision changed. I think that amid all the politics and that fundamental technological consideration is one that's likely to be fairly persuasive in a number of developed economies. In the developing world, I suspect it won't be. And if you look at Sub-Saharan Africa, or parts of Asia, parts of Latin America, they're the Chinese companies, because they're going to be first to market on 5G, have an excellent opportunity to steal a huge amount. Now, there is a risk for us globally that what we could therefore get is a system in the world of two different technical standards around 5G will then also have an impact on 6G and on 7G. So we're in a moment where if things go wrong, we could actually see a separation and a bifurcation of a global system that up to now has been more or less one.
Right, thanks. A very detailed answer on that. And okay, conscious of time, final question for you, Nick, on human race. Will the human race be able to live with this virus as it is, as there is no vaccine to control it at the moment? Do you think we will be able to live with it as any other viruses that has been coexisting with us all this while?
Great question. The reality is that human race is living with it now. Questioner is quite right that there is no vaccine. There's no absolute guarantee of a vaccine. Most countries, we're way off herd immunity, but always governments and people are learning. In terms of treatment of COVID-19, hospitals have got better at working out how to make patients more comfortable, which drugs can help at various stages or with particular symptoms of the disease. Work on vaccines is ongoing. A vaccine is unlikely to be a silver bullet. The first vaccines might not work. If you're doing your testing pre-certification on the basis of 10,000 people or 30,000 people, evidently you're not going to uncover all the problems that exist if you're rolling a vaccine out to billions of people. I think it's interesting, UK, for instance, is planning on inoculating just under half of its population, and is doing so on the basis that we'll have to give everyone a jab not once but twice. So the idea that it's going to be a short-term thing, we can have maybe a booster. So the reality is we're going to be living with COVID-19 for a long time, and that even in countries that maybe are able to afford a vaccine, the logistical challenges of rolling it out to millions and millions of people are so great that it's going to take time, a considerable amount of time, that it's probably not going to be something where you can inoculate everybody. We couldn't be sure that if we have a vaccine, it's going to work for years and years. So yes, I suspect COVID is going to be around for a long time. The trajectory would suggest it's going to be less of an issue over time because we will find ways to manage it and work with it. But for right now, I don't imagine that this is a problem that is going to go away in the space of 12 or 18 months. And I don't think the news that we get one day, the first vaccine is developed, means we can set our watches that in 18 months, everything will be back to normal.
Yeah, agree. Right, okay, thanks, Nick, because we've already passed 30 minutes on our session. Thanks, Nick, Juan, and Natalie. That's the end of the question and answer session. So over back to you, Disha.
Nick and Natalie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us, all the regional managers and the marketing team for your time and support. As we come to an end of our webinar, I would like to thank everyone for their time today. And there are a lot of ways that you can get in touch with us and find out more information about expert briefings. You can see it on the screen right now. Please do get in touch with us if you have any more questions or you would like to give us any feedback regarding the webinar. You will soon be receiving attendance certificates and recording from the session today. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a good day.